Once again, I'm very happy to be with you. My name is Father Terence Curley, and I'm with the Society of St. Paul again, as I have been over the years with them, and enjoyed their company and their support for the, the Ministry of Consolation and Bereavement. And certainly their support has made all the difference in terms of reaching out in the ministry and communicating some very new ideas lately that are really changing everything. The title of this particular video, this particular DVD rather, is The Bright Promise of Immortality, the New Science and Models for Meaning. And in this, what we're celebrating is the vast change that's happened to the models, a tremendous paradigm shift, something that is making all the difference, I believe, for ministry, and it will affect all of us that do grief ministry throughout the church. It'll affect our ways of approaching people, it'll affect our ways of trying to bring healing, and certainly as wounded healers very often ourselves, it'll affect our lives as well. The bright promise of immortality is a deepening of the meaning that we're seeking. We're searching for meaning and hope. There have been vast changes in our understanding about meaning and purpose and how they relate to the bereaved. What I'd like to start off with is a wonderful prayer from the preface of the Mass that really highlights how we as Christians, we as Catholics, believe in the bright promise of immortality. You'll hear in one of the preface for the burial of a Christian, you'll hear, "In him who rose from the dead, our hope of resurrection dawned. The sadness of death gives way to the bright promise of immortality. Lord, for your faithful people life is changed, not ended. When the body of our earthly dwelling lies in death, we gain an everlasting dwelling place in heaven." The bright promise of immortality is what has been with us from the very beginning as a church. We believe in eternal life. We believe in crossing over that passage that enters us into the kingdom of heaven. This particular DVD and the programs therein are meant to really serve as a companion to my previous DVD. In the previous one, we opened up the understanding about the new science of separation and loss, the new science of grief, and we talked about some of the authors, and we'll do that again. What I really want to do today is to take you a little bit further along the journey, a little bit further into our understanding as to how we minister and how the new findings make a difference for us, not only for the bereaved, but for ourselves, because all of us at one time or another experience loss, experience grief, experience bereavement. And in order to minister, our behavior is dependent upon our beliefs as to how we understand grief and how we understand how we can be with people in very critical times. One of the interesting things that happened lately, as I was talking to people about this particular DVD, was I talked to one person, and the person gave me a book called Who Moved My Cheese? And I kind of wondered with this book, it's sold millions of copies, and it's a great book, very simple parable, and it talks about change, and it talks about how we have to change. And I thought about it, perhaps I received the book because the idea behind it was that change is difficult. Change is painful to some people, and change sometimes even paralyzes us. I don't want to spoil the parable. It's very easy reading, it's quick reading, but it tells us how we have to be more aware that someone moves our cheese, someone changes. That's a metaphor for our lives. Something happens with the job, relationships, and certainly with grief that changes our lives. And are we really prepared to respond to that? So the parable has a good lesson, and if you get a chance, I'd say take a look at that because it does make a big difference. There are some very new ideas about grief and our understanding of it. And we have to realize that this shift in our understanding about grief has really taken place since 1917. If we were to think about what's happened in that span of almost 100 years, if we think about what really happened, there are some important dates all the way along, which developed a model that's called a standard model that we follow. And for the most part, it's starting to change with the new insights that we're receiving. But it started in 1917 with Sigmund Freud when he wrote a letter to different people about his own losses. But before that, what Freud did was he talked about the work of mourning. And from that developed a whole theory that we call grief work. But meanwhile, he wrote a letter at the death of his daughter Sophie, and he talked about how, well, it doesn't really end. It continues. There isn't a way of ever investing in anything else that'll make a difference. Yet everything he wrote about, to do grief work meant to actually let go, detach, and then reinvest in another relationship. That's a pretty painful thing to do. But that year, 1917, then in 1944, there was another major year with crisis intervention and Eric Lindemann, and their understanding about how people go through grief. It really did medicalize grief. And then in 1969 with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, another major change for our understanding about grief. But all of this, with the behavioral sciences, from that type of behavioral science, psychoanalytical approaches, was very secular, very one dimension. In the century before, Romantic times, people held on to a continual bond. And they did this throughout a lifetime and spilling over into eternity. It wasn't until the modern times with Freud. Now we're moving into a new era. We're moving into a postmodern times. And in the postmodern times, new research is coming about, new ways of understanding how we relate to the bereaved, and new ways of understanding and listening to how people really grieve. I couldn't help but think in the way we minister, the way we go to people's houses and we talk to them. And I couldn't help but think of sort of a scenario. According to the oldest standards, with Freud, the people have to do grief work, they have to let go, that language of letting go, they have to separate. And the goal of the pastoral visit would be, well, I want to help this person to detach from things in their lives and to move on. But now, you can almost picture someone sitting in a living room talking to perhaps a widow and her breaking down in tears. And the person who's ministering would think, well, that's a catharsis. Isn't that wonderful? She's getting rid of the pain, she's crying, and she's remembering what we're talking about, but she's going to let go of all of that and then maybe find even more hope in her life by moving on. Well, that's the pastoral minister's perspective. A counselor or anyone else would think, well, clinically, this woman has to separate herself from all of her memories, her dreams, her affections, everything. Sever that affectional tie. Now comes on the scene the new approach. Someone goes in who's aware of the fact that the goal we have isn't to detach or to let go or to sever ties. The goal we have is to find meaning and to experience what something really means. T.S. Eliot wrote in one of his poems a very important line. He writes, "We had the experience but missed the meaning." Well, we don't want to be like that. We don't want to have the experience and miss the meaning. So the second person comes in, and the second person is sitting in the living room as well and talking to the widow and asking her to tell stories, maybe some happy stories or sad stories. They'll go back and forth. That's the way we process the grief. The goal is to help her enter into a remembrance that carries on in her prayer life, in her spirituality, with what we now call the continual bond, an enduring bond, one that goes right straight through in a person's life and crosses over in their prayer life, certainly to the kingdom of heaven. The communion of saints, all of that is so very important for us as Christians. But the secular sciences don't always do that in the standard theories. And we'll talk much more as we go along about the standard theories and how they differ from what we're trying to do here in talking about new models and designing new models for ministry, especially the ministry of consolation. It won't be that simple step-by-step, phase-by-phase, or stages. It won't be any of that. It won't be what we'd call a quick approach to it, but rather what we'll have is a storied approach where we'll listen for certain things to help the person to find meaning, to help the person to be hopeful. And isn't that the way people grieve? I find when I talk in my workshops and my students, and I ask them, do you want to forget those who've gone before you in faith? Do you want to let go of that? And once you give them permission to say it's all right, then you'd be amazed at the response that you get. People are willing freely to talk about, of course I talk to my husband. Of course I talk to my friends or my children who've died. Because they're afraid up until then, given the austerity sometimes of our age, they're afraid to say, yes, I do have conversations. Yes, I do believe in that. And yes, it is a continual conversation. And I do hope to see them again. So, as with death and dying and with all of the understandings about loss, it isn't something that is purely secular. It isn't something that we could say, oh, this emotion and that emotion right in a row. It's not like that. There's a wide range of emotions. There certainly is the shattering experience and the sadness that we experience. We know that. But at the same time, we realize that there is the joy. And even oscillating between joy and sadness. I used to think when I was younger as a priest, in homilies and in funerals and all of that, that it was amazing to me how someone would tell some story at the end of Mass, something that was funny, and I'd say, gee, I wonder if that's appropriate. But now I realize that's the way we grieve. God made us in such a way that sometimes we recall the very, very happy things, even joyful things that we laugh about. And then other times we go back to the sadness, things that really burden us, things that shatter us. And we oscillate, as I said, between the two. So the new understanding, the new psychological understandings, the new insights for behavioral science are more compatible now than ever with what we've had for the last 100 years. Not just secularism, it's like we call it a reductionism really to just psychology alone, thinking that if I follow these steps, I follow these stages, or I follow these phases, all these tasks, that all of a sudden I'll be better. Well, there's certainly no guarantee for that. If anything, sometimes by doing that, the person finds themselves in worse shape. Because when you try to suppress a memory, it's going to surface. And when you try to say that I'm going to go over something and make it painful, well, it doesn't serve any real good purpose, because that isn't the way the human brain works or the mind works. It works totally different from that. So we learn from the bereaved, and we're learning new approaches, new constructions, new ways of experiencing a worldview. And it's a design that has to take place in a more personal interaction. And that's the new ministry, and that's what I think we have to start looking at and thinking about. The Catholic cemeteries in Pittsburgh, I sometimes, what I do is I'll look around on the internet and see how other dioceses are doing, and it's a wonderful thing to do. They have a very ambitious program, and the bishop there, Bishop Zubik, actually makes some wonderful remarks about the first place where we experience evangelization. And on their website it actually says, did you know that the very first place of Christian evangelization was the cemetery? The angel said to Mary Magdalene at the tomb, he's not here, he's been raised. This is the first proclamation of the good news that Christ is victorious over death. So I thought that was a wonderful insight, because being victorious over death is the promise of eternal life, the promise of immortality. What we see in what we walk by faith, not by sight, but what we see in our mind, in our belief, And our faith and our trust in God makes all the difference as to how we take this journey. Makes all the difference for the meaning and not missing the meaning. It isn't all about, well, I have to let go of these feelings. I have to decathect, is what they'd say. I have to let go of this and let go of that in order to move on. I did mention how Freud had trouble, and he had real trouble with that. He had trouble about Sophie, as I said, his daughter. He also had trouble about his grandson. When his grandson died, he was devastated. And as we know, Freud himself had a very difficult death himself. So in his own personal life, it didn't fit the theory. And that's what's really happened. The theories don't fit into the reality. Now you say, well, that's a problem, and it is a problem, but it's an even greater problem when we realize that when the theories don't fit the problem, and someone comes to us and they say, well, I'm not getting any better. I've gone through these tasks and these stages and these phases, and I've done all the things, the work of grief, the grief work, that's the term that's used, and I've tried to detach. And at the end of it, I'm maybe worse than when I went in. Stories told by George Bonanno about a college student in his book called The Other Side of Sadness. The story is told about a college student who, her father died, and then she came home, and her mother continually went after her saying, you have to get counseling, you're not showing enough emotions, you're not doing enough of that. And the girl obviously had a tremendous amount of resiliency. She had that inner strength that is so very, very necessary. So she went for the 7 sessions or whatever the insurance held. And at the end of it, she was worse, but she did it to placate her mother. What's that called? Well, that's called policing the bereaved. Saying to someone, you're not crying the way we want you to. You're getting married too soon. Or you're selling the house. You're doing all these things. There's something wrong with you, not the theory. And that's the problem. It's the theory that's wrong. It's the theory that doesn't allow for personal resiliency, personal expressions of grief. Yes, they have said all along in the standard theories, everyone grieves uniquely. But yet, if you don't follow our roadmap, then maybe we have some pathology here. Maybe we have some mental illness here. And that's far from the truth. It's not true at all. The remark also in the bishop's website that I thought was rather interesting is that he makes this insight for us, which we were talking about. They say that in the last 40 years there have been catalytic social changes which have fragmented neighborhoods, increased mobility of families, increased anonymity in parish life, altered ritual practices, and undermined our evolved practice of bereavement ministry, all right? And that's what we're looking at. What has undermined the bereavement ministry? What has gone wrong? What's gone wrong is that when we go to a house and we say, I'm going to help the person detach, it's far better to say, I'm going to pray with you, I'm going to find meaning, I'm going to find hope, and we're going to share that together. That makes all the difference, I think. Which leads me to the work that's being done by a very, very good writer, Thomas Attig. And what he's really concerned about as a writer is about, and as a psychologist and a philosopher really, he wrote a book called Catching Your Breath in Grief, and Grace Will Lead You Home. We'll use that when we have our 4th program. But I want to allude to a little bit now because I think the themes that he sets are very important for our understanding about the perceptions of loss and how people grieve. That's what grief is. It's the perception of loss. And it can be very subjective. And we realize when grief goes public, that's probably when people mourn. That's the way it's defined. Many definitions for grief. But the perception of loss, I think, is pretty good because it's how we in ourselves perceive something happening. He talks about breathing into sorrow. In other words, breathing into it, not denying it, but breathing into the sorrow. And breathing into sorrow helps us to find the spiritual meaning and seeking that which is hopeful, all right? We venture belief, as he tells us, you venture beneath life's surfaces, looking for healing and growth in deep currents within. You go where dialogue will leads and opens new ways of living. When you breathe into sorrow, sorrow loosens its grip. You expand beyond your ego's limitations and breathe more deeply into the fullness of your being and the world transformed by your loss. When there are critical situations, we lose our breath. We try to catch our breath. And that breathing into sorrow is really important for finding meaning and finding hope. Another key phrase that's used by him, but certainly used by other researchers as well in the modern times, researchers such as George Bonanno or Robert Nehemiah, they've written some wonderful books, and we've talked about those before. We'll talk about them again, The Other Side of Sadness and Lessons of Loss, or Reconstructing Meaning. These researchers are pointing the way in a constructionist approach. They're psychologists, but they're research psychologists. But they're also looking at meaning. And that's what is compatible with what we've been doing all along. And they do this because the grandfather to a lot of this experience of meaning goes back to someone such as Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist in the concentration camps. He had to have meaning, he had to have purpose, and we talked about that in the last DVD, and we're talking about it again because it's so important to underline our search for meaning, and that meaning is what makes all the difference in our lives. Why is it that some people can grieve and some people don't grieve, ostensibly? What's going on? Does everyone have to express certain things and have certain actions? Well, we're all different. And that's where the personal aspect of grief really does come in. And it does defy the fact that one shoe doesn't fit all, one size doesn't fit all, one roadmap isn't for everyone. It's really a crumpled up, useless roadmap, all right? And that's what I think we have to realize. The resilience, he talks about this, and I love the subtitle to his book as well. This is more of a poetic approach. His other books are more philosophical and psychological, but and grace will lead you home. See, here he is, a researcher, putting it into the context of meaning and grace. And that's what we do. We take life and we put it into the context of meaning. And that's what we do with all of our losses. Let me read what he tells you on page 33 of that book on catching your breath in grief. His amazing resilience abides within you. Beneath brokenness and crisis, the breath of life persists. You will live. Your will to live, soul, spirit, and love are not broken. The more easily you open to their life-sustaining flow, the more likely you will again breathe fully into life. That's wonderful. It means that we have, even though we may well be a soul in crisis, we may feel anguish, we may feel empty and abandoned and shattered, like a shattered vase. We may feel that way, but we also realize we can breathe into that. And in breathing into that, we possess a resiliency that makes all the difference, that actually helps us in our lives. So there is then this changing landscape for grief. And that's what we're really looking at. The way we minister is different, the way we act is different, the stories we hear, and listening for stories makes all the difference. And that's the focus that we have to get back in. Tony Walter, a well-known sociologist, actually has a wonderful quote that puts it into perspective in our own time. He says, "It certainly seems time to move beyond our current habit of using untested theories to create unnecessarily lengthy and agonizing models for coping with grief." And that's why I talked about Who Moved My Cheese. People don't want to change. It's easier to say, well, if I do 1, 2, and 3, therefore this will be the result. But grief isn't like that. It's a storied approach. And what will the result be? That I'll disconnect and reinvest That's the term that's actually used, to reinvest in a new relationship. Almost sounds like something from Wall Street. I'm going to reinvest, you know. The wrong term, wrong approach. And is there a replacement? Even Freud knew there wasn't a replacement for someone. There's no such thing as a replacement. And yet, this is what's done. You can almost picture people sitting in an office with someone on the other side who's the professional, the behaviorist, who's saying to you, the psychoanalytical model, is saying, well, here's what you have to do, here's the prescription, here's the prescribed behavior, here's what you follow, and these will be the results. That waiting room is filled with people who may go back and back again, and then finally realize in the end result that it didn't work. And that's the framework that we've been using in the old standards. Now we have these new standards, and the new standards are much better because we realize now that there are so many shortcomings to the cultural framework, so many things that can go wrong, so many things that are more culture than anything else, based on certain assumptions. And we have to question the language, question the assumptions, question the method, question the idea of letting go, that language of letting go. I often say to my students in workshops, how many people have been told to let go? And we're told that lots of times. So I'd like to just very briefly now talk about the fact that we don't go by tasks, we go by challenges. And the challenges make all the difference in the sense of we realize that we're challenged to continue a bond with those whom we love, not to sever our ties. Death is not the end of a relationship. Yes, we do relinquish a physical presence, but that's not the end of the relationship. And that's why our ways of remembering, our ways of telling stories, our ways of, in ministry, entering into another person's story is a great honor, and it's very important to do. But yet the standard theories, the emphasis has been purely on the emotional response, whereas we know differently. And you really have to know something before you feel it. It's almost concomitant, but synergistic, or whatever words you want to use. But the thing is, there's so much more to it. It's not the severing, it's the enduring bond. It's not having a roadmap or a set framework. It's realizing that there are unique challenges. In the standard theory, it's all psychological. It's not talking about the meaning that we need to have. The emphasis in the new approaches on meaning itself. It doesn't promote dialogue with the deceased. And that's why people are so fearful. They say, well, if I go to see someone, I say that I'm having a dialogue with someone, then they feel that they're mentally ill. And that's not true. So it's an ongoing and everlasting dialogue. It's not private, it's relational. And that's the thrust of what we have to do. So the ongoing bond is what we're really looking at. And that's what is so very important for all of us, that we realize that there is this continual bond, and that bond makes all the difference. Now, at the very end of each one of our times together, we're going to have some, what I call the ministry toolbox. And in the ministry toolbox, what we'll find will be different discussion questions, different ways of really being fortified, so that when we go into that house and we see someone, we'll have some insights as to what we're really doing there. We visit someone in the hospital, or we visit the bereaved in the family, after a funeral, or even before or during. And that makes us more aware of what ministry means for us and means for others. So the ministry toolbox, I want you to build a ministry toolbox so you won't feel insecure. You'll feel, yes, I can do this. And we can, with God's grace, do anything. And that's what's so important. God can do this, and grace is what helps us to help others catch their breath. And it helps us and helps others to find meaning, helps us and helps others to not lose sight of the kingdom of heaven, of our communion of saints, of our oneness, our Catholic doctrine that teaches so very much about that unity, that always connects us to the kingdom of heaven, that bond that we have with God, of course, first, and then with all of those who've gone before us in faith.